the struggle and setup. The bus rattled as it crawled across the uneven streets of the city, a battered relic that had carried thousands of workers like Amara Jackson to their invisible posts in towers of glass and marble. Amara sat pressed against the window, her reflection half visible in the smudged glass, her dark eyes focused on the skyline that loomed ahead. Each morning it felt the same, her own world fading into the background as she left behind narrow sidewalks with shuttered grocery stores and tired faces, only to step into a palace that was not built for people like her. At 28 years old, Amara had grown used to that shift, but it still pressed on her chest like a weight she could not set down. She wore her hotel uniform crisply ironed, the navy blue fabric thin from hundreds of washings, but still immaculate because her mother always said poverty was no excuse for looking poor. Her mother's words echoed in her even now, though her mother lay in a hospital bed miles away hooked to machines Amara could barely afford. Every dollar she made as a maid at the Grand Meridian Hotel seemed to vanish the moment she sent it toward medical bills, prescriptions, or late payments. Still, she carried herself with dignity, because that was the one thing life had not stripped from her. When the bus screeched to its final downtown stop, Amara gathered her small tote bag and stepped into the cool morning air. The Grand Meridian stood in the distance, gleaming like a monument to wealth and excess. Its 60 floors reflected the sun in mirrored brilliance, every pane of glass polished by people like her until no smudge could be seen. The guests who swept through its grand revolving doors carried designer luggage, wore tailored suits, and never once thought about the invisible army of housekeepers, cooks, and bellhops who kept their kingdom spotless. Amara walked past the glittering entrance and made her way to the hidden service door on the side, a plain gray portal tucked in the shadow, where employees entered unnoticed. She swiped her badge and was greeted not by chandeliers or soft piano music, but by the scent of bleach and the echo of hurried footsteps. This was her world: narrow hallways, storage closets, and orders barked by managers who never smiled. 3 minutes late again. "Jackson," came the clipped voice of Mrs. Patterson, the floor manager, her steel gray hair scraped into a bun that matched the steel in her personality. She didn't even look up from her clipboard when she spoke, but her tone carried the sting of reprimand. Amara opened her mouth to explain, to say that the bus had broken down on Fifth Avenue, but she stopped herself halfway. Explanations never mattered here. To Mrs. Patterson, a broken bus was just another excuse, so she nodded, her voice even. "Yes, ma'am. Won't happen again. See that it doesn't." Guests on 30 through 35 complained yesterday about streaks on the mirrors. Unacceptable. And today you'll be taking the penthouse floor. The Thorntons are arriving. Everything must be perfect. Mrs. Patterson's eyes finally lifted, cold and dismissive. "And remember, you are invisible to them. No chatter. No eye contact. Just do your work. Invisible." The word curled inside Amara like smoke. She'd been invisible most of her life. To employers, to strangers, to the wealthy guests who never noticed the hands that remade their beds or polished their marble sinks. Even now, as she nodded and pushed her cart toward the service elevator, she thought about how different her life might have been if she had been born in one of those penthouse suites, instead of a crumbling neighborhood apartment. The supply room buzzed with the usual tension of workers preparing for the day. Carts rolled, vacuum cleaners hummed faintly, and bottles clinked as they were arranged in neat rows. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Brittany called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Brittany was another maid, younger in years of service but somehow full of authority she had not earned. She smirked as she leaned against her cart, arms crossed. "Some of us actually care about our jobs." Amara ignored her, methodically stacking fresh towels on her cart, but Sophia, a new hire barely 19, looked up nervously. "Leave her alone, Brittany," she said softly. "The bus broke down. That's not her fault." Brittany laughed, a sharp sound that echoed in the cramped space. "Careful, Sophia. Stick around, Jackson. Too long and you'll start thinking this job is some kind of calling instead of what it really is. Cleaning. Up after people who wouldn't spit on us if we were on fire." Amara bent down to adjust her supplies, not rising to the bait. But when Brittany deliberately bumped Sophia's cart, sending bottles rolling to the floor, something in Amara stirred. She crouched quickly to help the younger maid gather the scattered supplies. "Don't worry about it, Sophia," she said gently. Then louder she added, "You didn't knock it over." She did. The room went quiet. Other workers pretended to busy themselves, but all ears strained to catch what would happen next. Brittany's eyes narrowed, her mouth twisting in mock surprise. "Excuse me? Did the help just talk back to me?" Amara straightened, meeting her eyes calmly. "We're all the help here, Brittany. Every single one of us." For a moment the tension thickened, but before Brittany could reply, Mrs. Patterson's sharp voice sliced through the silence. "If you have time to chat, you have time to work. Jackson penthouse level now." Sophia gave Amara a grateful glance as she wheeled her cart away, but Amara only smiled faintly. She had learned long ago not to waste energy on people who thrived on cruelty. Better to keep her focus on the work ahead, even if it meant cleaning up after people who lived in worlds she would never touch. The service elevator hummed as it rose, stopping briefly at each level. The air growing quieter, the decor more refined. Amara always noticed the divide. Floors 20 through 30 were for business travelers, practical and unremarkable. Floors 40 upward housed the kind of guests whose names appeared in glossy magazines. But the penthouse floor was different. That was where power lived, where people who controlled empires slept on sheets worth more than Amara's entire paycheck. As the elevator doors opened on the 60th floor, the hallway stretched out in pristine silence, lined with golden sconces and thick carpets that muffled every sound. It was here that Amara would spend her day. She began with Suite 6001, her movements practiced and efficient. Strip the bed. Check for forgotten items. Dust every surface, even the ones no guest ever touched. Perfection was demanded here, and perfection was what she delivered. Still, as she arranged orchids in a crystal vase and folded towels into flawless swans, her mind drifted. She thought of her mother lying in that hospital bed, her body frail but her spirit unbroken. She thought of the hospital bills that came like tidal waves, threatening to drown them both. She thought of her grandmother, long gone, whose hands had once guided babies into the world with nothing but courage and wisdom. That memory lingered in her mind like a whisper of another life, a reminder that strength did not always come from money or power, but from knowledge passed down in love. When she finally looked up, the hallway outside was alive with motion. Black SUVs lined the street below. Staff hurried in coordinated flurries, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Richard Thornton was arriving. Everyone knew his name. He was the billionaire whose pharmaceutical empire had made him untouchable. For families like Amara's, he was the reason medications cost more than rent, the reason her mother had to settle for weaker alternatives that did half the job. And yet, here he was, striding out of a Bentley, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit crisp, his smile polished for the cameras. Beside him walked Claire, his pregnant wife, delicate and elegant, her pale hand trembling as she clutched his arm. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. To the world, they looked like perfection. But Amara saw the tremor, the strain, the smile that never reached Claire's eyes. She saw the way Richard's hand gripped her arm, firm and possessive, as if she were another asset in his portfolio. Amara turned away quickly when Mrs. Patterson appeared at the end of the hall, her voice sharp. Jackson, Suite 6001 must be refreshed before they arrive. And remember, no conversation, no eye contact. You are invisible. Invisible, Amara thought again as she bent over to smooth the swan-shaped towels into sharper points. But deep in her chest, something stirred, a quiet voice that told her she wasn't meant to stay invisible forever. The breaking point. The atmosphere inside the penthouse suite carried the heavy silence of wealth, a silence that pressed down on everyone who entered. Amara moved quietly through the space, her cart stationed just outside the door, every detail of her work executed with precision. She had replaced the orchids, fluffed the pillows, polished the marble sink until it gleamed like a mirror, and set the champagne on ice at precisely the temperature Mrs. Patterson demanded. Everything looked flawless, yet beneath the glittering surfaces lingered the feeling of unease, as though perfection was only a curtain drawn over something broken. She did not have the luxury of voicing such thoughts, of course. She was a maid, invisible and silent, expected only to make every trace of imperfection disappear. Still, the tension in her chest grew each time she passed by the open medical bag she had spotted earlier on the dresser. Rows of prescription bottles lined up like soldiers. Anxiety medication, painkillers, prenatal vitamins. For a woman so young and elegant, Claire Thornton seemed to live tethered to those bottles. Amara tried to push the thought away as she adjusted the curtains, but voices drifted through the door, sharp and clipped. Richard's voice dominated, low but commanding. "I don't care what the Tokyo team says. If they want the merger, they'll agree to my terms. Otherwise, I'll bury them under litigation until they choke." Claire's voice followed, soft and trembling. "Richard, please. You promised this trip would be about rest. The doctor said I need calm, less stress. The doctor says what I pay him to say." Richard cut her off. "You're fine, Claire. Don't dramatize. You've got everything you could possibly need." Amara froze where she stood, heart hammering at the cold dismissal. She should not have been listening, she knew. But the voices carried through the thin line of the doorway. She heard Claire's breath hitch, the muffled sound of fabric shifting as though Richard had gripped her arm too tightly. Then silence, the kind that spoke louder than words. Amara finished her work quickly, retreating into the hallway with her cart before they entered. The last thing she needed was Richard Thornton's wrath turned on her. But as she wheeled the cart away, she couldn't stop thinking of Claire's face, the tremor in her hands, the forced smile for the cameras earlier. For all the world's wealth, Claire looked like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, fragile wings beating against bars no one else acknowledged. The day moved forward in its rhythm. Amara worked her way through other suites, always meticulous, always silent, while her mind tugged at the threads she had overheard. At lunch, she sat in the staff break room, a small square lined with lockers and plastic chairs, the hum of the vending machine filling the quiet. Sophia sat beside her, peeling the crust from a sandwich. "They say the Thorntons are staying for a week," she whispered, as though speaking the name itself demanded reverence. "Can you imagine? A week in that penthouse probably costs more than I'll make in a year." Amara smiled faintly but did not reply. She had already imagined it, imagined what that kind of money could do. How it could pay for her mother's treatments, erase debts, even give her the chance to study again. She remembered once wanting to be a nurse, following in her grandmother's footsteps of caring for others, but life had carved that dream out of her hands. Now she scrubbed marble floors for men like Richard Thornton, men whose wealth was built on the suffering of people like her mother. Marcus, one of the bellhops, dropped into the seat across from them with his tray of fries. "You should have seen the circus downstairs," he said. Photographers everywhere. That man loves a show. Walked in like he owned the hotel. And his wife looked like a porcelain doll about to crack. Sophia frowned. "She's pregnant, right?" 7 months, I heard, Marcus said, lowering his voice. But she didn't look good. Pale, shaky, like she might collapse. Amara stared at her untouched sandwich, the unease in her chest deepening. She didn't want to gossip, didn't want to let herself care more than she should, but something about Claire Thornton unsettled her. Perhaps it was the fragility in her posture, or the way her husband's presence seemed to drain the air around her. Whatever it was, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that danger was close, pressing against the edges of that carefully curated image. By late afternoon, the hotel buzzed with unusual tension. Staff hurried more than usual, whispers floating down hallways, phones ringing in the background. Amara returned to the penthouse suite to refresh the room once more, aware of every heartbeat in her chest. She knocked gently as protocol demanded, and when no answer came, she entered quietly. Claire sat curled on the edge of the bed, her face pale, one hand clutching her stomach. For a moment, Amara froze. She was not supposed to see this, not supposed to be anything but invisible. But Claire looked up, her eyes glassy with pain, and whispered, "Water, please." Amara hurried to pour a glass from the crystal pitcher, holding it out with careful hands. Claire sipped slowly, then closed her eyes, breathing unevenly. Sweat dotted her forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "Should I call the manager?" Amara asked softly, unsure if she was overstepping. Claire shook her head quickly, her voice faint. "No, Richard. He'll be angry if I cause a scene." Angry. The word struck Amara harder than she expected. Here was a woman married to one of the wealthiest men in the world, living in luxury most could never dream of. Yet she feared something as basic as asking for help. "Maybe you should lie down," Amara suggested gently. "It might help." Claire nodded, easing herself back against the pillows, her hands still pressed protectively to her stomach. Amara adjusted the pillows without thinking, careful not to touch too much, but unwilling to leave her struggling upright. When Claire's breathing evened slightly, Amara whispered, "I'll step out now, rest." She slipped out of the suite, heart pounding. She knew she had crossed an invisible line. Staff weren't supposed to comfort guests, weren't supposed to act like anything more than shadows. But how could she stand by when Claire was clearly unwell? Hours later, just as Amara was finishing her final suite for the day, a shout split the air. Harsh, panicked, echoing down the penthouse hallway. Richard Thornton's voice thundered, "Somebody get help. My wife, she's bleeding." Carts rattled, staff froze, heads turned with wide eyes. Panic swept through the floor like fire. Amara's blood turned to ice. The unease she had carried all day had finally broken into reality. She dropped her cloth and ran toward the sound, her legs carrying her faster than thought. The moment she burst into the suite, she saw Claire collapsed on the bathroom floor, blood streaking across the marble tiles, her hands trembling as she clutched her swollen belly. Richard stood above her, furious and helpless, shouting into his phone. "Why isn't the ambulance here yet? Do you know who I am? Get someone up here now!" But no one moved. No one except Amara. The emergency, the sight before Amara, was something she would never forget. Claire lay sprawled across the cold marble bathroom floor, her pale skin nearly the same shade as the tiles, a halo of sweat dampening her golden hair. The crimson streaks beneath her body stood in horrifying contrast to the sterile luxury of the suite. For a long moment, everything seemed frozen. The silent horror in the eyes of the staff clustered in the doorway, the frantic shouting of Richard Thornton as he barked orders into his phone, the shallow gasps of Claire as she tried to cling to consciousness. And then, like a floodgate breaking, Amara felt the rush of memory and instinct. She saw her grandmother's hands, dark and sure, guiding her through stories of childbirth in their old neighborhood. Back when hospitals were too far and too expensive for many, she had watched her grandmother deliver babies with nothing but courage, hot water, and a steady voice. That knowledge lived in her still, buried beneath years of polishing silver and folding sheets, waiting for a moment like this. "Step back," Amara heard herself say, her voice steady despite the chaos. The staff in the doorway looked at her in shock, frozen between fear and obedience. Richard snapped his head toward her, his face livid. "Who are you to give orders? You're a maid." His words dripped with contempt, but beneath the anger there was something else, panic. His phone call hadn't connected to help. The ambulance was delayed, the traffic in the city a snarl of congestion, and his empire meant nothing in this moment where blood-stained marble and his wife's life hung in balance. Amara knelt beside Claire, ignoring his fury. "Mrs. Thornton, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice gentle, calm, and unwavering. Claire's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. She clutched Amara's wrist with surprising strength. "The baby. Too soon." "It's going to be okay," Amara whispered, though fear clawed at her own chest. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Richard slammed his phone down on the counter. "Where the hell is that ambulance?" His voice cracked, his carefully composed persona shattering in the face of helplessness. He looked down at Amara with wild eyes. "If she dies, if something happens to the baby, then let me do my job," Amara interrupted firmly, surprising even herself. "I may not be a doctor, but I've seen births before. I can help her until the ambulance gets here, unless you want to stand there and watch her bleed." For once, Richard Thornton, the man who commanded corporations, dictated markets, and silenced boardrooms, fell silent. He stepped back, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a mixture of rage and desperation. Amara turned her full attention to Claire. "Listen to me," Amara said, her voice lowering into the soothing cadence she remembered her grandmother using. "We need to keep you calm. Your breathing is too fast. Slow it down with me. In and out. In and out." She demonstrated, inhaling deeply, exhaling steadily, never breaking eye contact. Claire's breaths began to sync with hers, still shaky but more controlled. She barked instructions without hesitation. "Sophia, boil water, bring towels. Marcus, call downstairs again, tell them we need paramedics on this floor now. Mrs. Patterson." She hesitated, locking eyes with the rigid manager who had always dismissed her. "Get blankets. She's losing heat." For a second, no one moved. They weren't used to hearing orders from Amara, but something in her tone, in the calm authority that rang out above the panic, broke through their paralysis. They scattered, moving quickly to do as she said. Claire groaned, curling against the pain, her hand gripping Amara's tighter. "It's too early. The baby isn't ready." Amara brushed damp hair from her forehead. "Babies don't always follow schedules. But I promise you, you're not alone." She pressed towels gently beneath Claire, her mind racing. She had no sterile instruments, no monitors, no machines, only instinct, memory, and willpower. But sometimes that was enough. The minutes dragged like hours. Claire's contractions grew sharper, her cries louder, the marble bathroom echoing with the raw sound of life forcing its way forward. Richard paced like a caged lion, barking at anyone who entered, but Amara shut his voice out. Her world narrowed to Claire's breathing, the rhythm of pain and pause, the faint but growing pulse of possibility that somewhere within this chaos was a child waiting to be born. At one point, Claire sobbed, collapsing against the tiles. I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Amara said firmly, pressing her hand against Claire's. "Listen to me, Claire, you're stronger than you think. Right now, you're the only one who can bring this baby into the world. Not your husband, not the doctors who aren't here, you. And I'm right here with you." The strength in her voice was enough to pull Claire's gaze back from the edge. She nodded weakly, tears sliding down her cheeks. But she kept breathing, kept pushing when the contractions demanded. Time became a blur of shouted instructions, the rush of footsteps bringing more towels, more hot water, blankets to shield against the sterile chill. Amara's uniform clung to her with sweat. Her arms ached, her knees pressed painfully against the hard floor, but she refused to waver. Every part of her focus was on keeping Claire alive, keeping the baby safe, holding chaos at bay with nothing more than courage and the memory of her grandmother's wisdom. And then, amid the whirlwind of panic and pain, a new sound filled the room, the thin, sharp cry of a newborn. The sound pierced the air like a miracle, silencing every voice, even Richard's. Amara held the tiny, wriggling infant in her hands, wrapped quickly in a towel, her own tears blurring her vision. She placed the baby gently against Claire's chest, guiding her trembling arms to hold the fragile life she had fought to bring into the world. Claire's sob broke through the silence, half laughter, half anguish as she clutched her child. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, unable to find words. For all his billions, all his power, he had been powerless here, and the woman he had never noticed, the maid he considered invisible, had saved what mattered most. As the wail of approaching sirens finally reached the windows, Amara leaned back against the bathroom wall, exhaustion washing over her. She had done it. Against every odd, against fear, against the gulf between wealth and poverty, she had done it. The transformation. The sirens outside grew louder until they wailed directly beneath the glass facade of the Grand Meridian. Moments later, the heavy pounding of boots echoed down the penthouse corridor. Paramedics burst into the suite carrying their equipment, their uniforms stark against the gold-trimmed walls. They stopped short at the sight that greeted them, Claire Thornton clutching a newborn to her chest, her hair plastered with sweat, her face pale but alive, and beside her, kneeling on the marble floor, was Amara, her Navy hotel uniform streaked with blood, her expression exhausted yet steady. One of the paramedics glanced at Richard, then at Amara. "Who delivered?" Richard's lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were wide with disbelief. He looked down at Amara, as though only now seeing her for the first time. The silence stretched until Amara spoke herself, her voice hoarse but calm. "I did. She started bleeding before help arrived. The baby came too fast." The paramedics nodded briskly, moving forward to examine mother and child, but not without giving Amara a look that carried respect, even gratitude. They had seen many emergencies, but they knew courage when it stood in front of them. One of them knelt by Claire, checking her vitals, then looked at Amara again. "You saved them both." Claire's trembling hand reached for Amara's, gripping it tightly even as the paramedics worked around her. Her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the force of sincerity that cut through the room. "Don't leave me." Amara felt the warmth of the newborn's cry echo through her bones. She swallowed hard, nodding. "I'm here. I won't leave until you want me to." Richard, standing rigid beside the counter, looked utterly out of place in his own suite. He had been the master of every boardroom, the titan of every negotiation, but in this moment he seemed reduced, small against the enormity of what had just happened. His gaze flickered between Claire, pale but alive, and the infant in her arms, and finally landed again on Amara. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but words failed him. For perhaps the first time in his life, he had no command, no declaration, no insult, only silence. The paramedics eventually lifted Claire carefully onto a stretcher, swaddling the infant securely in her arms. Richard hovered, his hand twitching as though to reach for her, but Claire turned her face toward Amara instead. Her lips formed the words again, softer but unmistakable, "Don't leave me." And so Amara walked beside the stretcher, her steps quiet but sure, guiding them through the penthouse and into the elevator where the team descended to the ambulance waiting below. The staff gathered in hushed clusters, stared as the procession passed, some with awe, some with disbelief. A maid had done what none of them dared. A maid had saved the billionaire's wife and child. When the ambulance doors closed and sped away with sirens piercing the air, Amara remained on the curb, her hands still stained, her uniform damp, her heart pounding with exhaustion. She felt exposed under the city lights, the chaos of traffic swirling around her. For a moment she wondered if, after all of this, she would be reprimanded. Perhaps Mrs. Patterson would scold her for overstepping, for daring to act beyond her station. Perhaps Richard Thornton would decide her presence in his suite had been a violation. Perhaps the invisible would be punished for daring to be seen. But as she stood there, chest heaving, she realized none of that mattered. She had done what needed to be done, not for recognition or approval, but because a woman had been in danger and she could not turn away. The thought filled her with a quiet strength she had not felt in years, a reminder of who she was before the world told her she was invisible. Back inside, the penthouse suite remained in disarray. Towels and blankets lay strewn across the floor, streaked with crimson. The scent of antiseptic lingered, mixed with champagne that had grown warm in its bucket of ice. Staff moved nervously, cleaning in silence, their eyes flicking toward Amara with a new kind of respect, even reverence. Sophia approached timidly, her voice shaky. "You were incredible. I didn't know you could. That you knew how to—" Amara shook her head gently. "I only did what I had to do." Anyone would have, but Sophia shook her head firmly, her young eyes wide. "No, not anyone. We were all frozen. We didn't know what to do. You were the only one who moved." The words sank deep, though Amara offered only a tired smile in response. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt drained, every muscle aching, her mind replaying the sound of Claire's cries and the slippery weight of the newborn in her hands. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a spark of something new. Not pride exactly, but a recognition that perhaps she was not as invisible as she had always believed. Hours later, when Amara finally returned home, the city had slipped into the stillness of night. She climbed the narrow staircase to her apartment, her limbs heavy, her uniform still faintly marked despite her attempts to scrub it clean in the staff restroom. Her mother's voice greeted her from the bedroom, weak but warm. "Amara, you're late. Are you all right?" Amara stepped into the room, forcing a smile as she sat beside the hospital bed wedged into their small living space. "I'm fine, Mama, just a long day at work." Her mother studied her face, her eyes sharp despite her frailty. "Something happened. I can see it in your eyes." Amara hesitated, then sighed softly. "A woman. She went into labor too early. There was no help yet. So I did what I could. I remembered what Grandma used to do. And the baby lived." "She lived?" Her mother's thin hand pressed against hers, a tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek. "You see, you were always meant for more than scrubbing floors. You have her hands, her courage. Don't you ever forget that, child." Amara swallowed hard, her chest tight. She wanted to believe it, wanted to cling to that truth, but the weight of bills on the counter and the knowledge of tomorrow's shift pressed against her hope. Still, her mother's words lingered, wrapping around her like a fragile but powerful shield. The next morning, the Grand Meridian buzzed with whispers. News traveled fast, especially when it involved the hotel's most powerful guest. Staff spoke in hushed tones about what had happened, about how the maid no one noticed had saved the life of the billionaire's wife and child. Some retold the story with awe, others with disbelief, but all eyes turned when Amara entered the staff corridor. For the first time in years, people saw her not as just another uniform, but as someone extraordinary. Yet not everyone was pleased. Mrs. Patterson summoned her to the office, her expression pinched, her tone as sharp as ever. "Jackson, I've received word of your involvement yesterday. While the outcome was fortunate, you overstepped boundaries. Staff are not to interfere with guests beyond their assigned duties." Amara stood straight, meeting her gaze evenly. "With respect, ma'am, if I hadn't interfered, Mrs. Thornton and her baby might not have survived." The older woman's lips thinned. "That may be true. But understand this, your position here remains the same. Don't let this incident give you ideas above your station. Amara nodded once, silently. But inside something had shifted. She had seen life begin in her hands. She had faced the fear of failure and acted anyway. No scolding could erase that truth. What she didn't know, however, was that in a hospital room across the city, Claire Thornton clutched her newborn tightly and repeated the same words she had whispered before the paramedics carried her away. "Don't leave me." Her husband stood at the window, staring out at the skyline with a haunted expression. For the first time in decades, the master of empires realized his billions had been powerless when it mattered most. The maid he had never noticed had become the only reason his world still stood intact, and he could not forget it. The aftermath and redemption. The city's newspapers carried the story within days. Not the whole truth, of course. Not the details of marble floors streaked with blood or the maid's trembling hands guiding life into the world. But fragments slipped through. Headlines celebrated the safe but premature birth of Richard and Claire Thornton's child, plastering their faces across glossy covers. Reporters speculated on the health of the mother, the fortune of the family, the name of the newborn. No one wrote of Amara Jackson, the hotel maid who had been the first and only line of defense against tragedy. Yet within the walls of the Grand Meridian, her name was on every tongue. Staff whispered as she passed, their eyes filled with respect. Sophia clung to her side more than ever, shadowing her in the corridors, insisting on carrying extra linens as though the weight of Amara's deeds still lingered in her arms. Even Marcus, who had always masked sincerity with jokes, tipped his hat in quiet reverence when their paths crossed. For once, Amara wasn't invisible, and yet the recognition carried a weight she wasn't sure she wanted. She had not acted for applause, but because she could not have done otherwise. Her shifts continued as usual, polishing silver and stripping beds, scrubbing away the messes of those who would never know her name. Mrs. Patterson remained rigid, refusing to acknowledge anything beyond routine. But Amara felt something shift in herself. Each task no longer seemed to diminish her. She had seen the line between life and death and stood firm when others faltered. No matter how many towels she folded or floors she swept, that truth would not change. Then one evening near the end of her shift, she was summoned. Not by Mrs. Patterson, but by a sharply dressed man from the front desk. "Mr. Thornton has requested your presence in the penthouse," he said with a tone that was half command, half disbelief. Amara's heart jolted. Her first instinct was fear. Had she done something wrong, overstepped too far? But beneath the fear was curiosity. She smoothed her uniform and rode the service elevator up, the silence pressing on her ears with each rising floor. The suite was quieter than she remembered. The air subdued, curtains drawn against the glitter of the city. Richard Thornton stood near the window, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his tailored suit abandoned for a simple sweater. He looked less like the titan of pharmaceuticals and more like a man who had not slept in days. Claire sat propped against pillows on the bed, the newborn swaddled in her arms. Her face was still pale, but her smile, genuine and tender, lit the room. When she saw Amara, her eyes filled with tears. "You came," she whispered, her voice weak but warm. Amara hesitated at the threshold. "I didn't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Claire said firmly, though her voice shook. "You're the reason we're here. Both of us." She looked down at the tiny bundle against her chest. "Meet Emily." Amara's breath caught. The baby's delicate features peeked from the blanket, her cries soft but insistent, her presence filling the suite with fragile power. Amara stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly, and when Claire lifted the child toward her, she froze. "No, I can't." "Yes, you can," Claire insisted. She should know the hands that brought her into this world. With reverence, Amara accepted the baby, her arms cradling the weight with instinctive care. Emily's warmth seeped into her, fragile and fierce all at once. Tears blurred her vision as she looked down at the child, the living proof of what had happened that night. She had cleaned countless rooms, erased countless traces of other people's lives. But here in her arms was something she had created, not by blood, but by courage. Richard cleared his throat, his voice deeper than usual, stripped of its practiced polish. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." He hesitated, the admission catching like a stone in his throat. "You saved my wife. You saved my daughter, and I did nothing." His gaze fell to the floor, his shoulders heavy. "For years I've believed money could solve anything. That power was everything. But in that moment, I was powerless. And you, someone I never even noticed, did what I could not. Amara shifted, unsure what to say. She had never imagined hearing such words from a man like Richard Thornton. She shook her head gently. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because she needed me. That's all. Claire reached for Amara's hand, her grip still fragile but filled with sincerity. No, that's not all. You gave us our child. You gave me back my life. And I won't let this world pretend you're invisible any longer. The silence that followed carried more weight than any applause. Richard nodded slowly, his expression one of reluctant respect, perhaps even shame. He stepped closer, his tone steady though softer than before. I want to help you, Amara. Whatever debts you carry, whatever burdens, consider them gone. My people will see to it. Amara stiffened, instinctively wary. Charity from men like Richard often came with chains. But then she thought of her mother, frail and waiting at home, tethered to a bed they could barely afford. She thought of hospital bills stacked on the counter like bricks building a prison around them. Slowly she nodded. Not for me, for my mother. She deserves care she's been denied too long. Richard's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head. Done. Claire smiled through her tears, her eyes shining with gratitude. And when you're ready, I'd like you to come visit often. Emily should know the woman who brought her into the world. For a long moment, Amara stood there, the child warm in her arms, the weight of years of invisibility melting under the light of being seen, truly seen for the first time. She had stepped forward when no one else had, and in doing so, she had changed not only the fate of a family but the course of her own life. When she left the penthouse that night, descending in the same service elevator that had carried her invisibly for years, her reflection in the mirrored walls looked different. She was still a maid in a Navy uniform, still the daughter of a mother fighting illness, still a woman who took the bus across town every morning. But she was also something more, someone who had faced fear and chosen courage, someone who had carried life in her hands and refused to let it slip away. And though the world outside still roared with inequality, and though tomorrow would bring its share of struggle, Amara knew a truth that no one could take from her. She was no longer invisible.